Medusa, the victim the world called a monster. Chapter 1. The Unblemished Temple. Lean in, a little closer. We've all heard the name. We've seen the statues, cold marble, frozen in a scream. The writhing snakes, the eyes that turn a man to salt in stone. We've been taught that she was a trophy to be hunted, a nightmare to be decapitated by a hero with a shiny shield. But history is a fickle thing. It is written by the victors, and it is sung by the gods who have a habit of hiding their crimes in the shadows of monsters. Before there were snakes, there was hair like spun gold. Before there was stone, there was a girl whose laughter echoed through the marble halls of Athens like a silver bell. Her name was Medusa. Close your eyes and try to smell it. Not the scent of rotting meat or wet scales we associate with her now, but the scent of ancient holiness, the sharp, metallic tang of ozone that lingers in the air after lighting has struck, the heavy, sweet perfume of frankincense burning in tall bronze braziers, the salt air of the Aegean Sea drifting through the high, open columns of the Parthenon. Medusa was not born of the dark. She was a priestess of Athena, the maiden goddess of wisdom. To be a priestess was to be untouchable. It was to live in a world of white stone and blue sky, a world where you were protected by the most powerful mind on Olympus. She moved through the temple with a quiet grace, her bare feet clicking softly against the polished floor. Every morning she would tend to the fires. Every evening she would sweep the dust from the altars. She was beautiful, so beautiful that people began to whisper. They said her hair was more lustrous than the goddess she served. They said her eyes held a depth that even Athena's owls could not reach. But beauty in the world of the gods is not a gift, it is a beacon. Imagine the weight of the darkness in the temple at night. It wasn't a scary darkness then, it was a sanctuary. The shadows were long and cold, stretching across the floor like velvet ribbons. Medusa felt safe there. She believed that the bronze gates of the temple were a barrier that even the tides of fate could not cross. But gods do not care for gates. Poseidon, the earth shaker, the king of the deep, had noticed the girl in these white robes. He didn't see a priestess. He didn't see a woman with a soul. He saw a challenge. He saw a way to insult his rival, Athena, by taking something that belonged to her temple. The air in the temple began to change. The sweet frankincense was choked out by the thick, choking smell of stagnant seawater. The sound of the wind through the columns turned into a roar of a hurricane, trapped within four walls. The ozone intensified, the hair on Medusa's arms standing up as the atmospheric pressure dropped. She was alone. The bronze gates, most massive, heavy doors that were supposed to keep the world out, did not creak. They did not groan. They simply yielded. The floor of the temple, once so cool and comforting, became slick with brine from the sea foam. The shadows weren't ribbons anymore. They were tentacles of cold, wet dark. Poseidon did not come as a lover. He came as a storm. He came as a force of nature that takes what it wants and leaves only wreckage in its wake. Medusa ran. Her footsteps, once a rhythmic click of grace, were now the frantic slaps of a haunted animal on the wet stone. She ran to the foot of the great statue of Athena. She clung to the cold marble legs of her goddess, begging for her protection. She prayed for the wisdom she had spent her life serving. She expected the lightning to strike. She expected the shield of the goddess to fall between her and the sea god. But the gods are not like us. They do not value loyalty. They value territory. The violation happened there, on the sacred ground, in the very shadow of the divine. And when the seeking was finished, When he retreated back into the salt and the foam, leaving the air smelling of dead fish and broken promises, Medusa remained, shivering, broken. The temple was silent again. The ozone was gone. The weight of the darkness was now a crushing thing, a shroud that felt like it would never lift. And that is when she heard it. Not the comfort of a mother, not the rage of a protector. She heard the sound of the goddess's sandals on the stone, a slow, rhythmic, terrifying sound. Tap, tap, tap. Athena had arrived. But she hadn't come to comfort her priestess. She had come to look at the stain on her floor. Medusa looked up, her eyes streaming, expecting a hand to reach down and pull her up. Instead, she saw the cold, grey eyes of the goddess looking down with a disgust so sharp it felt like a blade. To Athena, Medusa wasn't the victim. She was the vessel of the desecration. She was the one who had brought the filth of the sea into the house of wisdom. Lean in closer now, because this is where the story you know actually begins. Athena didn't strike Poseidon. She couldn't. He was a brother of Zeus. He was too big to punish. So she looked at the girl trembling on the floor. She looked at the golden hair that the people had dared to compare to her own. If you are so beautiful that even the gods cannot stay away, the goddess whispered, her voice like a grinding tectonic plate, then let us make sure no one ever looks at you again. Can you hear it? The sound of the transformation. It wasn't a quick flash of light. It was a slow, agonizing stretching of the skin. The golden hair didn't just change. It began to wake up. Chapter 2. The Curse of Protection. Imagine the sensation of your own identity being unmade. Medusa reached up to touch her face, to wipe the tears from her cheeks. But her skin no longer felt like silk. It felt like cold, toughened leather. Her fingers didn't find the soft, familiar waves of her golden hair. Instead, she felt a violent, rhythmic twitching. The first snake didn't just appear. It tore its way out of her scalp, then another, and dozens more. Each one a part of her, yet possessing its own hungry, primitive mind. They didn't just hiss. They screamed in a frequency only she could hear. Can you feel the weight of the darkness now? It wasn't just around her anymore. It was on her, a crown of living nightmares that never slept, never silenced, and never let her forget what had happened. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the silence of the goddess. Athena stood back, her Aegis gleaming with a cold, judgmental light, watching as the priestess's eyes, once deep and full of life, began to glaze over with a terrifying, milky sheen. Medusa tried to cry out for help. She looked toward the temple guards, men she had known for years, men who had bowed to her in respect just hours before. As her gaze fell upon the first guard, something impossible happened. The air between them didn't just turn cold, it vanished. There was that smell again, ozone, sharp and electric, as the very molecules of the air crystallized. The guard didn't have time to scream. He didn't even have time to blink. One moment he was a man of flesh and bone, his heart thundering with fear. The next he was a pillar of grey, unyielding granite. She looked to the next man, her hands outstretched in a plea for mercy, and the result was the same. Snap. The sound of a soul being snuffed out by a glance. She was a biological weapon, a walking void. This was Athena's wisdom. The goddess knew that a woman broken by a god would always be hunted by men, so she gave Medusa the only protection the world allows a monster, the power to destroy anything that looks at her. It wasn't a curse of punishment, it was a curse of absolute isolation. Medusa fled the temple. She couldn't stay in Athens. Every bird that flew over her turned to a pebble and dropped from the sky. Every blade of grass she stepped on became a jagged shard of flint. She moved through the city like a shadow. A veil pulled over her head, but even through the fabric, her power leaked out. She headed toward the edges of the map, toward a place where the sun begins to fail and the sound of the bronze gates of the world seems to echo in the wind. She found her way to the island of Sarpedon, a place of jagged cliffs and perpetual mist. It was a graveyard of things the world wanted to forget. There she sought out her sisters, Satheno and Uriel. They were Gorgons by birth, immortal monsters and terrifying, but they were her blood. Imagine the reunion. Two sisters who were born as monsters looking at their youngest sister who had been made into one. They didn't turn to stone. Their immortality acted as a shield against her gaze, but they wept for her. Their cries weren't human. They sounded like the grinding of sea stones in a storm. Together they retreated into a cavern deep within the cliffs. This cave became her kingdom. It smelled of damp earth and a metallic tang of petrified blood. Medusa sat in the absolute center of the weight of the darkness, her snakes finally settling into a low rhythmic sway. She realized then that she no longer needed the bronze gates of the temple. She was her own gate. She was the lock and the key. But the world wouldn't let her rest. Rumors began to spread across the seas. They didn't talk about the priestess who was betrayed. They talked about the Gorgon. They talked about the beast that lived in the cave guarding treasures that didn't exist. They turned her pain into a challenge. Every few months, the silence of her cave would be broken. She would hear the clank of bronze armor. She would hear the huffing breath of a young man seeking glory. Medusa, they would shout, their voices trembling with a mix of fear and greed. Show yourself, monster. She didn't want to fight them. In the beginning, she would hide in the deepest crevices, covering her eyes with her hands, praying they would just go away. But they always came closer. They wanted the head. They wanted the trophy. And eventually, she would have to look. She would step out from the shadows, her snakes tasting the air, sensing the heat of the intruder. She would see the hero standing there with his sword drawn, his face twisted in a mask of manufactured courage. And she would feel a flicker of the old ozone. Look at me, she would think, a bitter, cold rage finally beginning to replace the sorrow. Look at what the gods have made. Look at the truth you're so desperate to kill. And they would look. And they would freeze. And Medusa would be left alone once again in a forest of statues. Statues of men who died trying to kill a woman who was already dead. Chapter 3. The Silence of the Gorgon. Time is different when you're a monster. For the people of Athens, seasons changed. Kings rose and fell. Children grew into men, and men returned to the dust. But for Medusa, in the bowels of the island of Sarpedon, time was a stagnant pool. There was only the weight of the darkness, thick and suffocating, and the low rhythmic pulse of the snakes upon her head. They were her only company. They whispered to her in a language of vibrations, feeling the scurrying of a centipede on the wall, the shift of the tides outside, the approaching heartbeat of a fool. She became the queen of a silent kingdom. Walk through her cavern in your mind. It isn't a lair of bones and gore, as the poets say. It is a gallery, a museum of failed ambition. Every few yards, a silhouette emerged from the gloom. A warrior frozen in mid-stride, a spear leveled at a shadow, a face contorted in a permanent mask of horrific realization. Medusa moved among them like a ghost tending a garden of stone. She would reach out and touch the cold granite cheek of a boy who couldn't have been more than 18. She would feel the rough texture of his armor, the frozen braid of his hair. She knew their names, not because they told her, but because she could see their entire histories in that one final electric moment of the ozone flash. She wasn't just a killer, she was a mirror. When these men looked at her, they didn't see a woman. They saw their own greed reflected in the milky glass of her eyes. They saw the hubris that told them they were entitled to her life for the sake of the song. And in that moment of looking, the truth became stone. Can you imagine the loneliness of that? To be the only living thing in a forest of statues. To speak and hear only your voice bouncing off the chests of the men who no longer breathe. She began to forget the sound of her own name. To the world, she was the Gorgon. She was a landmark, a "Here be monsters" scrawl on the edge of a map. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, even when the snakes grew sluggish and cold, she would sit by a small, trickling spring at the back of the cave. The water was dark and clear. She would lean over the edge, her hands trembling, tempted to look at her own reflection. But she knew the law of her existence. Even the source of the curse was not immune to the curse. If she truly saw herself, not just her face, but the truth of what she had become, she too would join her gallery. She would be a statue of grief, frozen forever at the edge of a dark pool. So she lived in a world where she was the only person she could never truly see. She started to hate the light. The sun was a reminder of Athena, bright, piercing, and unforgiving. The sun was a light that had watched her violation and done nothing. So she pushed further into the dark. She learned to navigate by the flicking tongues of her sisters and the heat of the earth. She grew to love the sound of the bronze gates of the underworld, which she imagined she could hear through every floor of her cave. It was a deep, metallic thrumming, a reminder that there was a place deeper than this island, a place where the shadows were even heavier, where perhaps even a monster could find a bed that didn't feel like a grave. She found a strange peace in the isolation. The rage that had consumed her in the first years, the desire to tear the eyes from the gods, began to settle into a cold, hard obsidian. She stopped running. She stopped hiding. She realized that her monstrosity of a sanctuary was a sanctuary. For as long as she was a Gorgon, she was safe from the Earthshaker. For as long as her hair hissed and her eyes burned, no god would dare touch her again. The snakes were a wall. The stone was a fortress. But the gods are patient, and they are petty. They do not like a piece of their own handiwork to find peace. High above on the sun-drenched peaks of Olympus, a plan was being formed. A shield was being polished. A pair of winged sandals was being laced. Athena had not forgotten her stain. She had been watching Medusa in the dark. She had seen the gallery of stone grow. She saw that the girl she had broken hadn't withered away in shame. She had become a legend, and a legend that cannot be controlled as a threat to the order of the civilized gods. The ozone began to gather again, but not in the cave. It gathered around a young man named Perseus, a boy with a famous father and a desperate need for a legacy. Medusa felt it. Far below on her island, she felt the shift in the atmospheric pressure. She felt the weight of the divine gaze returning to her. The snakes on her head began to writhe in a frantic, rhythmic warning. A hero was coming. Not like the others. Not a boy with a bronze sword and a loud mouth. This one would come with the backing of the heavens. This one would come with the wisdom of the goddess herself. She stood up in the center of her dark kingdom, her leather skin tightening over her bones. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't need one. She just waited in silence, listening for the first footfall of the man who would come to save the world from a victim it had created. Chapter 4. The Reflection of Deceit. He didn't come like a man. He came like a ghost. Perseus did not walk onto the island of Sarpedon with heavy tread and a shouting heart. He arrived on the wings of gods, draped in the weight of the darkness that wasn't his own, the cap of invisibility, a gift from the shadows of Hades. He was a thief in the night, a silent blade sent to finish a job that Athena had started years ago. Can you smell the shift in the cave? The damp earth and salt were suddenly pierced by a smell that didn't belong in the deep, the smell of ozone mixed with the metallic scent of a freshly forged mirror. Medusa stood in the center of her gallery. Her snakes were frantic now, 100 rhythmic tongues hissing in the air, sensing a heat signature that flickered in and out of existence. They hissed at the empty air, baring fangs at the shadows. She knew he was there. She could feel the divine pressure in the atmosphere, the same pressure she had felt in the Temple of Athens, but she couldn't see him. For the first time in centuries, the mirror of truth found nothing to reflect. And then she saw it, a glint. It wasn't the glint of an eye or a sword. It was the polished bronze surface of a shield, held high and angled toward her. Think about the cowardice of that shield. The gods knew that no man could look Medusa in the face and survive, because to look at her was to face the reality of what they had done. So Athena gave Perseus a way to kill her without ever having to acknowledge her humanity. He looked at her through the bronze, a filtered, safe, distorted version of the truth. He looked at her reflection so he wouldn't have to look at her soul. Perseus moved with a calculated, rhythmic precision. He watched the shield, tracking the movement of the writhing snakes as if he were watching a map of a distant land. To him, she wasn't a woman. She was a coordinate, a target. Medusa didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply realized the final, cruel joke of the gods. They had turned her into a creature that could only be seen through a mirror, and now they were using that very mirror to extinguish her. She could have run. She could have retreated into the blackest cracks of the earth where even the reflection cannot exist. But the weight of the darkness had become too much to carry. She was tired of the silence. She was tired of the forest of stone statues that reminded her of every life she had ever been forced to take. She watched the reflection of the boy as he drew closer. He was young, his face smooth, his eyes filled with the blind certainty of the hero. He believed he was doing something noble. He believed he was slaying a monster to protect the world. He didn't know he was just the cleanup crew for a divine crime scene. As he raised his sword, the harpy, a curved blade of adamantium that could cut through the very sound of the bronze gates of reality, Medusa didn't turn away. She let the snakes fall still. She let the rhythmic hissing subside into a low, mournful sigh. She waited for the moment the metal would meet her skin. The ozone in the air reached a breaking point. The cave seemed to hold its breath. Perseus didn't even look at her at the end. He kept his eyes fixed on the shield, watching the silver milky eyes in the reflection, his hand trembling only slightly as he swung the blade. The sound wasn't the clash of epic battle. It was a soft, wet thud, a sound of finality. As her head was severed from her body, a strange thing happened, something the poets usually leave out of this heroic song. From the blood that spilled onto the cavern floor, two beings were born. Chrysaor,
the giant with the golden sword, and Pegasus, the winged horse. Even in death, Medusa was a creator. Even from the wreckage of her body, she gave birth to the beauty and strength. She had carried the seeds of life within her all those years, locked away in the stone of her womb, waiting for the moment the curse would end. Perseus didn't wait to see the children born of the blood. He didn't look at the face of the woman he had just killed. He reached out with a leather sack, his eyes still averted, and shoved the head inside. He didn't see the tears that were still wet on her stone face. He didn't see the way the snakes finally stopped fighting and simply lay still like a crown of fallen leaves. He took the trophy and fled, the wings on the sandals beating a frantic rhythmic retreat from the island. He left the gallery of stone behind. He left the sisters, Statheno and Uriel, to scream their grief into the salt mist, a sound so terrifying that it became the origin of the funeral dirge. The hero was gone, the monster was dead, and the world was finally safe for gods who had broken her. Chapter 5. The Weaponization of Grief. Perseus took the head, but the story didn't end with a clean kill and a celebratory song. Think about the horror of what happened next. Medusa was dead, but her power, the power of her suffering, refused to die with her. She was no longer a woman. She had been reduced to a tool, a weapon, a severed thing carried in a bag by a boy who didn't even have the courage to look at what he was holding. As Perseus flew over the red sands of Libya, blood dripped from the leather sack. Every drop that hit the scorched earth didn't just dry up. It birthed a serpent, venomous, quick, and deadly. The desert itself became a graveyard because of the hero's careless flight. The ozone followed him like a storm cloud, a lingering electric charge that heralded the presence of a broken goddess. He used her. He didn't just bring the head back to fulfill a vow. He used her face to settle his own scores. He encountered the Titan Atlas, the giant who held up the weight of the darkness of the sky. Atlas was tired. He was weary of the infinite burden, crushing pressure of the heavens on his shoulders. Perseus didn't offer him a kind word or a moment of rest. He reached into the bag. He pulled out the head of Medusa. Imagine the sound of the bronze gates of reality slamming shut as the Titan looked upon the face. Atlas didn't just die. He became a mountain range. His bones turned to rock, his hair into forests, his shoulders to peaks that touched the clouds. Perseus didn't see the tragedy in it. He saw a convenient way to clear his path. He used her again to save a princess, Andromeda, from a sea monster. But even there, the heroism was tainted. He didn't slay the beast with a sword or a feat of strength. He showed it the face of a woman who had been violated by the very god of that sea. He used Medusa's trauma to kill the creature of her tormentor. Finally, he returned home to Seriphus. He walked into the hall of King Polydectes, where a feast was in full swing. The king was a man of greed and lust, much like Poseidon had been. He had tried to force himself upon Perseus's mother. Perseus stood at the entrance of the hall, the weight of the darkness of his journey hanging heavy on him. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't call for a duel. "You wanted a gift?" Perseus shouted over the rhythmic clatter of the banquet. "Here's your gift." He held the head aloft. The ozone flash filled the room, blindingly white and cold. In a heartbeat, the laughter died. The wine didn't spill. It froze in the cups. The king and his court were turned into the gallery of stone, their faces preserved in their final moments of gluttony and mockery. But Perseus knew he couldn't keep her. The head was too heavy, not in pounds, but in the rhythmic pulse of the divine power that still thrummed in it. It was a constant reminder that he hadn't won this victory. It had been loaned to him. So he did the only thing a hero does when he finished with his tool. He gave it back to the one who had ordered the hit. He returned to the temple of Athens, the very place where the gold hair had first been turned to snakes. He walked up the marble steps, past the bronze braziers, and he handed the head to Athena. Imagine the goddess taking the head. She didn't bury it. She didn't give Medusa a funeral. She took the severed face and she fastened it to the center of her shield, the Aegis. This is the ultimate insult. The victim's face was now a permanent decoration on the armor of the one who had abandoned her. Whenever Athena went into battle, whenever she wanted to strike fear into the hearts of her enemies, she would raise her shield, and the world would be forced to look into the eyes of Medusa one more time. The goddess turned the stain into a badge of honor, the badge of her office. She took the tragedy and made it her trademark. And so Medusa's face became the symbol of protection for the very gods who had denied it to her when she was alive. She became the Gorgonian, the ward against evil, the face of the gates, the face on the shields, the face on the coins. She was everywhere, and yet she was nowhere, because no one was looking at the woman. They were only looking at the shield. Chapter 6, the final reflection. So we come to the end of the song. The heroes have their statues. Athena has her shield. The snakes have finally stopped their hissing. But if you listen closely to the weight of the darkness outside your own door tonight, you might realize that the story of Medusa never truly ended. It just changed its skin. We like to think we are more civilized than the Greeks. We tell ourselves that we have moved past the age of monsters and petrifying glares. We've built our cities of glass and light, and we've mapped every corner of the sea that Poseidon once ruled. But the modern thinness is a lie. Beneath the skyscrapers and the digital glow, the same ancient architecture of betrayal still stands. We still live in a world that is terrified of the victim's gaze. When a woman is broken by a power far greater than her own, what is the first thing we do? We look away. We find a filtered version of the truth, a shield, to protect our own comfort, and we call her a monster for her anger. We call her difficult for her snakes. We would rather turn her into a trophy or a cautionary tale than look her in the eye and acknowledge the gods who failed her. We still prefer our truths in stone, solid, unmoving, safe. But Medusa's curse was never about the stone. It was about the ozone, that sharp, electric charge that happens when someone finally stops being a victim and starts being a consequence. It was about the power of being so terrifyingly herself that the world had to freeze in her presence. Think about that shield of Athena one last time. Even now, thousands of years later, when we want to protect something, we put Medusa's face on it. We put her on our gates, our jewelry, our high fashion labels. We use her image to ward off evil, but we forget that she was the one evil was done to. Perhaps that is the real secret of the Gorgon. She didn't turn men into stone because she was hateful. She turned them into stone because she was the only one in the universe who could force them to stop and stay still. She forced them to stop their hunting, stop their shouting, and for one final eternal second, just look. The next time you look at a statue, don't just see the marble. Think about the heart that might have been beating beneath it. And the next time you see a woman the world has called a monster, look a little closer at the hero holding the bag. The darkness is heavy tonight. and the fire is burning low. But remember, some things aren't meant to be fixed. Some things aren't meant to be feared. Because in a world of beautiful lies, the monster is often the only one telling the truth. Good night, and keep your eyes on the shadows. You never know when snakes might start to wake up.